Hello and welcome. Thank you all for being here today on this November 2nd, 2021. I am Nick Kanoki, the Director of Technology for the Asset Leadership Network, and I am excited for our conversation that's coming on resilience. And before we get underway, I just want to thank our patron sponsors, Definitive Logic, Onuma System, ABS Quality Evaluations, and ABS Group, as well as our organizational members, especially Lifecycle Engineering, for Jesse Rothkopf's participation today and in other programs that we're up to. And again, we would not be able to do programs like this in our newsletter and other functions of the Asset Leadership Network without the continuing support of these organizations. So for that, we are very grateful. And we also want to highlight the Andrew James Advisory Group quickly before we get underway. They are doing an A55K professional certification course that starts December 6th. And there's limited seats available because there's been a lot of interest in it. So if you're interested in that type of ISO 55000 professional development, reach out to the Andrew James Advisory Group or anyone at the ALN and we can direct you that direction. Before we get underway, I just want to say that if you're out there watching, we would love to hear from you. So please send any comments, questions, or feedback to the chat or use the Q&A function of the Zoom webinar, and we will pass those questions along to our panel today. And with that, I will pass it off to Mike Bordenaro, Director of Communications for the Asset Leadership Network.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you to our panelists today. We have Brian Weaver from ABS Group. We have Dragan Komljenovic from the Hydro-Quebec and Jesse Rothkopf, who is with LCE Lifecycle Engineers. And we'll be talking about resiliency in asset management today. And this topic has been generated by Jesse's idea of equating preparation for emergency management with preparation for asset management. So Jesse, why don't you start us off by telling us what made you think about this topic and where it led you?
Thanks, Mike. Well, to me, first of all, resilience is the buzzword that you're hearing all the time now. There's a lot of discussion around resilience in the supply chain, resilience in operations, and resilience is really just a function of planning that goes along with asset management. When you're planning for utilizing your assets, whatever type of organization you're in, or at least for an asset intensive organization, the planning for the use of those assets, the people within your organization, the systems that you use, and the processes that you use, they need to be tied in with your asset management planning and your resilience planning. Those two are linked together.
And have you seen enough emergency situations where it would have had been good to have had an effective asset management plan that linked to the emergency management plan?
I think we've all seen quite a few in the past year or two. But, aside from pandemic response, there's also major weather events that have been going on. We'll talk with Dragan about what happened up in Canada. We saw the cold weather snap down in Texas just recently, some superstorms in the Northeast, where those assets, the response and recovery time were greatly elongated because the ability to get their hands on those assets and get those assets up and running according to the mission was longer than needed to be.
Okay, well, why don't I go ahead and share my screen so we can kind of scroll through a bit of the paper, give people an understanding. There's an image that Jesse took. You want to say anything about the image, Jess?
It's actually an image of public infrastructure here in South Carolina, where I'm from, down in Mount Pleasant and Charleston, South Carolina. But it just struck me as the lines in the image kind of bring a convergence point. And the title of this paper that Mike and I are putting together is really the convergence of asset management and resilience during disruptions and everyday operations. Seemed appropriate.
Right. So if we just kind of go over the executive summary a little bit, you don't have to read the whole thing, Jesse, but you want to talk about some of the highlights there?
Sure. Well, the first bullet there is integrating resilience with your asset management program, and particularly a structured asset management program. The Asset Leadership Network are big proponents of ISO 55000, which is a great structure for asset management. It is the standard for structuring your asset management program. So if you follow an ISO program, or if you're even modeling after an ISO program, it's good to build resilience in at every level of that program as well. Second bullet is really the lessons learned from preparing for and responding to disruptions are really helpful in preparing for everyday operations for your asset management program, and vice versa. So whatever you do in your normal everyday operations, you want to have as much commonality between everyday operations and disruptive events or emergency protocols as possible. You don't want to be training people in new systems and unfamiliar territory when they're in the middle of a chaotic disruption. And then the third bullet there is that organizations need to look beyond their immediate organizational boundaries. Sometimes it's very difficult just to get an asset management program to go through your entire business, whether that's a public sector business or private sector. But especially with public infrastructure, you need to involve all of the stakeholders, like you do with any ISO standard. You need to look at all the stakeholders that are involved. That can involve the roads and highways, the community, the power systems that supply your organization. It really extends beyond your organizational boundaries.
So I wanted to especially emphasize that second bullet. We're talking about disruptions instead of emergencies, because the pandemic has shifted everyone's thinking that it's not just weather events. It's any type of disruption to your business, could be economic downturn or whatever. And so that kind of expands it from this emergency preparedness to the disruptions. And the resilience is a focus now because it's more than just reliability. And Jesse, you want to talk a little bit about resilience and reliability and the difference in those two topics?
Well, resilience is the ability to absorb some sort of disruption or some sort of event and recover from that in as short a time as possible, or just to be able to recover. That is really the definition of resilience. Reliability is focused on just keeping your assets, your people, your processes as close to the mission as possible, making sure that you're getting the value out of those assets. Together, they really help an organization to keep that reliability going, whether during normal operations or a disruptive event.
Okay, so thanks. So we're not going to go through this whole thing, just going to touch on some of the takeaways and kind of show you the outline. And one of the reasons why the ALN was excited to address this topic is because people are starting to understand that weather events are occurring on a much more frequent basis and are starting to make plans for that. And it's important to make those plans in turn in conjunction with the day-to-day operations also. And like Jesse said, we are a big proponent of the ISO 55000 structure for asset management. Use any structure, but that's the one we recommend. Don't know of too many others that contend on that level. And we think that this is a good way of getting people into the idea of a structured asset management plan. Anything you'd like to mention about the following the natural maturity curve or anything, Jesse?
Well, I would say that every organization that I've come across, they have room to grow on that asset management maturity curve. I've dealt with organizations that are really just emerging and putting together their program, and organizations that are pretty well integrated, but there's still room for improvement. And in fact, the organizations that are more mature actually are quicker to improve and really expand their asset management program. And it's really the same for resilience. When you tie resilience in, it follows that exact same maturity curve. The more you understand resilience, the more you build it into your program, the more you'll see opportunities to keep building it into the program and enhancing those capabilities.
And one of the presentations from last week was by the Air Force. And it was really good to hear them say, we're 15 years into a 20-year program. And it's like, okay, we're talking about big things here that take time. And if you're a big organization, get started, because it's not something that just happens overnight. So yeah, I think we'll all right, so here are some of the key topics that were addressed. Jesse, you want to kind of just touch on each one of these, and then we'll close this share screen, and we'll just start a discussion.
Sure. Okay. So asset registry, this is really about knowing the assets that your organization controls and assets that you'll need for responding to an event. Assets that could be impacted by a disruptive event, assets that are involved in your everyday operations, and assets that would be needed to respond and recover from an event. We'll talk a little bit in the paper about how you can share some of that information across organizational boundaries. Mutual aid is an accounting tool that allows organizations to loan and borrow assets from each other and facilitate the accounting of those assets. So if a utility must borrow some trucks, some linemen, some cable from another utility after an event, they can compensate that other utility for those. Commissioning and decommissioning, this looks at, everybody understands commissioning and decommissioning of assets, but in a disruptive event, you might have something like a hospital that we saw that during COVID, where U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and some other organizations had to rapidly commission some field hospitals. And the idea from a resilience point of view is to really model that commissioning and decommissioning process so that you can do it quickly and effectively. Maintaining idle assets and upcycling assets. This is a resilience topic that gets beyond just response and recovery. It looks at, for example, an oil platform. These are very expensive capital investments that for oil exploration. And if the price of oil goes below a certain threshold, these assets are often mothballed. They're taken offline. It doesn't make financial sense for you to keep exploring for oil if the return on that investment is not there. But even when those assets are mothballed or taken offline, they still need to be maintained. And upcycling those assets could be when they come back online, bringing them in for a higher use purpose or a more substantial purpose. Configuration management, this gets
before we
Yep.
leave maintaining idle assets and upcycling assets, the Texas problem last year was a great example of that. You want to talk a little bit about what part of the problem was there with not having their idle assets readily available?
Well, I think I'm not sure actually. I'm not sure where you're going with that one, Mike.
So a lot of the generators that were going to be used for their problem times were not ready to go. They would have had to have been fired up prior to being frozen. And so they had all this equipment that could have helped, but they didn't foresee the temperatures crashing, going down so low. And so they couldn't start the backup generators.
That's right. Yeah, excellent point. And that also can get into some asset registry and mutual aid types of discussions where they have to maintain those assets, even if they're borrowing them from other sources. But yeah, excellent point. Configuration management, this is just a tool to standardize the configuration and the maintenance activities around particular assets, so that in the event that you have to bring new assets online quickly, they are built to a common standard that people understand. And if you are loaning those assets, the configuration management allows you to the borrowing organization to make sure that they understand exactly what the maintenance procedures are, how to take care of those assets when they're under their custodianship. And it gets into other areas of making sure that you eliminate variances in your asset registry so that you can have better control over those assets as well. And then establishing best practices for operations, maintenance, and reliability. This is really, just the core of asset management in general. Just getting your organization back up to best practices. And we talk a little bit about why that's necessary, not only for asset management, but for resilience.
So thank you for getting us into that, and it will be available. But anybody here who is interested in this can look at the draft and make suggestions. Please reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat, and we can share that with you, and appreciate any comments. So Brian, you had a chance to review that. Do you want to make any comments? And please tell us your full title.
Sure. So I'm Brian Weaver with ABS Group. I'm the Vice President of our Risk and Reliability Consulting Services here. Our main purpose is really to help manage operational catastrophic risk. So kind of this subject is near and dear to my heart with a lot of what we do. I think one of the key points in here in the paper and in general from putting together an asset management plan, again, it goes back to that point one about your asset registry, what are the critical assets? And we like to look at these in a couple of different ways. First off, what are the ones that are critical to your business operations? And those are the ones, you're going to maintain them differently. You're going to keep spares to them differently. There are also the things that you have to make sure you've got plans to recover first. The other list of that assets that I like to look at and think through is what are the ones that if they fail, they may not be as critical necessarily to your operations, but they may be more critical to safety of life and safety of the environment. And those are the things that when you're putting together those plans, you have to know what those things are that you have to shut down in an orderly manner if something's gone wrong. And here on the Gulf Coast, so I'm in Houston for those who aren't aware. We've got a lot of the petrochemical refinery business along here, and there's a lot of nasty stuff that is in some of these big containers. And you have to be aware that if something fails in that space, bad things can happen if you don't handle it in a very expedited and proper manner to do those things. And if you don't know what those things are, if you haven't identified those assets, properly, you end up flailing, and a lot of people run around with their hair on fire trying to get things situated to where they should be. So I think, again, I think Jesse and Mike did a nice job of identifying those things in this paper. But that's the thing that I think if most companies would key in on that at one aspect, they'd be light years ahead of where they are today.
And Brian, since you have the floor, could you answer the first question that we have come up? How do you compare resilience to adaptability?
So it's funny, adaptability is almost I look at that as a common day-to-day business practice. How are we adaptable? And we look at that with regards to adaptable to markets, adaptable to customers' needs, adaptable to what else, other things in the world. That resilience is, to me, and again, you're getting the Brian Weaver opinion, so $1.25 and that'll buy you a Coke. But that resilience is more along the lines of how much can my business absorb before something really breaks? And what I mean by that in this case is if things break, if I have assets that are broken, that fail, am I resilient enough in my business? So do I have the emergency preparedness procedures in place? Do I have a continuity of operations plan? Do I have these things in place that I can recover quickly? Adaptability, it's almost a day-to-day operations thing in my mind.
And that's akin to having an agile
Yes,
operation.
exactly.
Okay. Jesse, any comments on that?
Well, Brian brings up one really good point, especially when we're talking about public infrastructure. You bring up many good points, by the way, but one that I wanted to comment on was these are systems, big, complex systems of systems. And when you start talking about resilience and reliability, the more complex these systems are, the more that can go wrong. And, when we talk with Dragan, you're going to see that from some of the use cases he talks about, where once the systems start to break down, the network starts to break down, that's when recovery gets more difficult, more complex as well. So I think that's really an important thing. Asset criticality, that's asset management 101. Get your asset registry established, then determine what are those critical assets. Think about which ones you need to maintain in the most formal manner, and start building that asset criticality out from that point of view. But from a resilience point of view, also think about the assets that you don't maintain that you are absolutely reliant on. If you're a transit system, you're reliant on the power system. If you're a power utility, you're reliant on the roads and highways. So just keep in mind that those assets extend beyond your organizational boundaries.
You're making CEO Jim Dieter very happy by saying that. Is there any examples of anything that can be done to those assets that you don't own?
It's really a question of engagement. And, I think Dragan will have some ideas on what he's seen with in Hydro-Quebec and the utilities. But you really need to look, when you're talking about resilience and planning at a community level, if you're the community utility for power, start talking with the roads and highways people, the DOT. Same with the water utilities. Water utilities need to be speaking with the power. There needs to be some communal discussion around resilience at that level. And that extends to private organizations too. One of the examples we have in the paper is at COVID, here in Charleston, we have a Boeing manufacturing plant. They stopped producing airplanes for the most part because travel was down, but they had a lot of masks and oxygen tanks. What could they have done with those masks and oxygen tanks? There were hospitals that needed those. Perhaps those are some shared assets that could be loaned out through mutual aid.
Excellent. Thank you for those examples. It helps bring it home to people. And Brian, Dragan, we're going to get to you, but I just want to talk a little bit about, before we get to you, other COVID disruption examples. If there's anything that you saw that was a good example of how an organization was resilient to COVID, or perhaps without naming names, an example that was not good in terms of not being resilient.
So I'll say I think there's a lot of good examples out there, and we probably all work for companies that were impacted in some way, shape, or form, where we had never really flexed our IT muscles to the extent that we had to at the beginning of COVID, when everybody got sent home. I think a lot of people were better at it than what they anticipated in some of those things. The bad examples are the guys that, and I won't name names for sure, but the companies that we saw where their response was to go down to a skeleton crew and defer maintenance across the board. We've seen a couple of those companies that have done that. They kind of, I hate to say, they shelved their maintenance plans, but they did a bare bones maintenance plan. In two of those cases, we're doing an incident investigation today, actively doing incident investigations for equipment that failed and people that were hurt. Those are the bad examples of COVID responses. And it stemmed from them going to a skeleton crew and not doing proper maintenance on equipment.
And the disruption of COVID and the pandemic is, beyond the assets, maintenance of equipment, it's use of assets now. There are entire fleets that are sidelined. There are buildings that are not being used. And now there needs to be adaptability for how to use assets in new and innovative ways, due to the fact that we're not traveling and we're not going into offices.
I do have one other comment real quick, if you don't mind, on something
Sure.
Jesse mentioned when he's talking about extending that resilience, especially in the public world. But I also look at it from company to company, business to business, where you've got to build that resiliency into your supply chain in some way, shape, or form. And we see that often with the disruption. I mean, it's obvious in the news, this disruption in the supply chain, but people didn't think about that in a lot of ways. If I'm sole source to one company overseas and that source gets shut down, what is my next option? And that has when we look at a enterprise risk level, that's a big thing that we look at as well. And when I say we, it's everyone on this call, we should all be looking at that. What is the resilience of my supply chain? What are the problems? What are the things that could go wrong there? What are my plans to manage that?
Jesse, you want to make any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's like a great, that kind of wraps up the whole idea of asset management and resilience, where you really need to look at your entire enterprise, your entire organization, and that can extend beyond your organizational boundaries. It's supply chain, it's those other organizations that support you, and with public infrastructure, we're here for the community and the culture to flourish, so that reliance goes both ways. The organizations that provide these services and the services that are needed in order to provide those services.
Right. So just like we have the weather forecasting, understanding what road closures or additional or different routes might be necessary to deliver goods and services is important. Have that as part of your information that you're managing on a regular basis, so that when there's a disruption, you can adjust accordingly. So Dragan, thank you for waiting patiently. Would you like to comment on anything that you've heard so far before we ask you to provide a real life example?
So I prefer to show a few slides and perhaps some of answers we see in chat and in discussion could be answered through those slides, and we could discuss that later if you want.
Okay, excellent.
So I will share my screen.
Go ahead and share your screen. Yep.
Do you see my screen?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Only to illustrate what we are speaking about, resilience, asset management, and so on, and risk management. I would like to illustrate the case, the discussion through an extreme ice storm we had back in 1998 in Quebec, where we at some places we had over 5 inches ice accumulation, and it caused a major disruption in our electrical system, electrical power system, and you see a few images from this period, and it is known in the world. So before starting, I would like to present Hydro-Quebec, some numbers. It is a major electrical utility in Northeast America, and with almost 20,000 people, almost 38 gigawatt installed generation power, over 34,000 kilometers of transmission line, up to 765 kilovolt, over 500 transmission substation, 15 strategic interconnections with the states and the Ontario, distribution grid, and so on. What is important to know that our major generation units are far in the north, and major consumption centers are far in the south, the Montreal region, states, Ontario, and it is more than 1,000 kilometers of transmission line through very harsh climate conditions. It is huge engineering and scientific challenge to adequately operate this system. So what happened in 1998? We got an accumulation of ice on our transmission lines up to 5 inches, and I am going to present that through the usual resilience concept, where we had a normal operation, and the absorption, the loss of performance between 5th and 10th January 1998, we lost up to 1.4 million customers, and the recovery phases was about 1 month. And after that, it is the adaptation. We have adapting for that for last 20 years. And one of the questions in chat was that what is the difference between resilience and adaptation? The adaptation is only one part of the whole resilience concept. It is the after the event. And when we are speaking about dimension of resilience, is this technical, technological, organization, social, economic, financial, reputation also, and business model. And in this case, this disruptive event was of the nature that we got a destruction of physical assets, and the 6 dimensions were tested. The reputation was tested, business model was tested, and so, but we got through that. So in terms of all those activities, Jesse has spoken about the importance of involvement of stakeholders. In fact, the recovery phase, given the huge dimension of this event, Hydro-Quebec only was unable to cope with this disaster. In fact, the whole society, government, both provincial and federal were involved, military, and so on and so on. So, but what we observed, it is some kind of unusual behavior of non-linearity of actions, emergency of risks and the situation, but also adaptation and self-organization. So with some lessons learned through lens of the absorption and recovery, the phases, we got some mobilization, what is important, mobilization and of management and employees, the importance of overall excellency in management, risk management, and so on, communication plans, excellent relationship with public and other government, civil and military structures. And in the adaptation phases is asset management is important. You know, it is you have to get your assets fit to service. It means robust assets, managing vegetation, maintenance plans, but also organize a satisfactory supply logic. What is important, innovation, research, development to cope with future events. And if you allow, speaking about COVID stuff, it is some talks about that. It is completely different situation. We don't have physical destruction of assets, but everything else is not good. Functioning is not good. So we got the problem with organization, social, economic, and financial dimension of resilience, and technological operation reputation in second order solicitation. But what is in particular with COVID or other pandemics is that it is a mixed, we are in a mix of phases in adaptation, recovery, adaptation, and so on and so on. We are going through that, and it is perhaps our new normal. We have to adapt to that.
Excellent. This COVID makes me wonder, what was the shift? So we'll get back to the ice storm, which is intriguing, and I want to know if anything else has come along and proven that you put in appropriate resilience measures. But for COVID, was there less demand? Was there less funds because people weren't going into offices and large buildings and arenas, so that you had excess capacity and not enough funds? What was the impact of COVID? What was the disruption for Hydro-Quebec?
In fact, it was for our commercial and industrial customers. It was the problem of they were in the stage of losing the productions, shutdown of production. So we were losing the clients, people, normal people, also some people with low revenues were unable to pay bills. And what we did is that the organization, instead of having a classical business approach, go no go, we collaborated all together to go through that, you know. And it was also the challenge of supply chains, and was also the challenge how to organize remote work for employees, you know, because it was used occasionally, but not in massive scale. So how are you going to organize, perhaps except from some maintenance crew and operational crew, all other people were able to work from home. But it is huge technological challenge to organize that in very short period of time, you know. But after 1.5 years later, we are right. We adapted to that.
Well, it's interesting that it was through stakeholder involvement. You sat down with your clients, and I suspect the management worked with staff to figure out what was needed to operate from home.
Yeah, the exception. And one of challenges was, and we analyzed those situations, what would happen if, for the pandemic reasons, we postpone some maintenance tasks, how the performance of critical assets would be degraded. We have to analyze that. In this case, we developed some models to make sure that what we can do, what we can't do to keep the whole system fit for service.
Okay, so you did some planning on how to reduce maintenance that apparently Brian has run into some organizations that did not.
Without putting in jeopardy the overall performance of the system.
Yeah.
And what Brian has spoken before is that what is important to know, all assets don't have the same criticality. The criticality is key. You can't slack the maintenance on critical assets. It is important to keep system running.
Brian, you're nodding. You have any comments there?
No, I agree with that wholeheartedly. You can save a lot of money by not maintaining the things that don't really need to be maintained on a regular basis. But you can't skimp on those things that are critical to your business and to safety. I tell you one thing I'll comment since I've got to jump in here. One of the things that Dragan touched on in his presentation is about having people trained and things like that. And I think an incident like that really highlights the fact that, in normal operations, you have to make sure your people are equipped properly and they're trained and there are procedures in place. And an event like that comes along and it really highlights, are your people equipped and are they trained and do you have the right procedures in place? Because it takes a lot of those day-to-day things that people go through, and it really puts them on steroids, and they have to go through a big recovery phase in that. And so I don't think people talk a lot about the technology. They talk about software and databases and everything else here. A big part of a good asset management plan has got to involve the training of the people and making sure that they're equipped to do their job. And frankly, a culture in the company. And by culture, I mean, you're not going to accept shortcuts. You're not going to accept cutting short your preventative maintenance plans and things like that.
Yeah, I like that. We discussed it before on this point. We as engineers, we are good in putting equation, building the model, and it is fine. But human and organizational performance, it is a soft issue, hard to solve.
Yes. And sadly, a lot of companies, they end up in a hero worship sort of phase where people, they praise that guy that comes in and he puts the Band-Aid on it and he works extra hours and goes away. And they don't praise those guys that kept everything running smoothly without those issues, or they handled it with minimal interruption.
Making sure that we avoid troubles, Yeah. And we have to praise those guys. The people like heroes. It is after the event. But also heroes are those people who avoid disruptive events happening.
Yeah. Great.
So Brian, what you brought up about culture is something that's coming up over and over again through this conference, and the need for leadership to establish that from the top. And what's happening is there is such an explosion of new tools and processes that every organization can dramatically transform their mission success through a systematic, a structured approach to using these new tools and processes. And if you're going to be disrupting and then resolving your organization with the tools and processes, it's helpful to have a guideline such as ISO 55000 to adhere
Yes.
to and let people rally around.
Yeah, too many times you see companies that just go after the tools and they don't have a good framework like ISO 55000 to fall back on, where they said they built it from there and use the tools and enabling tool for their program. And so they expect the technology to solve their problem. So.
And Jesse, in terms of the culture of resilience, how do you see that as something that can benefit organizations?
That is the most fundamental part for the leadership to focus on, because as a leader of an organization, you are the one with the authority and the responsibility to build that culture. As a leader, you might not be able to foresee all the different resilience issues that come up. You might not be able to understand all the asset management questions and problems, but you can, and you are, it's a mandate to build that culture that really aligns your people, the people that work in your organization, the people that support your organization, your customers, all the people, the processes around asset management and resiliency, the tools and technology that you have, your computerized maintenance management systems, your SCADA systems, et cetera, and those physical assets. So aligning the people, process, tools, and physical assets, that is how you build a smarter culture. That's how you get that culture to start thinking about resilience, about asset management. And as a leader, that if I were to coach any leader where to put my focus, especially for an asset intensive organization, that's where I would tell them to go.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you for that. Okay. Now, Dragan, back to you, and maybe even show the screen again, because you were showing some transmission towers that were wiped out, but right next to them, there were transmission towers that weren't wiped out. Were those ones that had been reconstructed to solve the problem, or did they have some resilience built into them and they were able to withstand the ice storm?
The actual question is, if we measured the resilience, say in December 1997, just a few days before this major ice storm, and if with all that work we have done for 23 years, we are at a higher level of resilience. The power grid, Hydro-Quebec's power grid in November 2021. What is the gain? And we with all that stuff we have done, we are still working on that to quantify the gain in resilience, but it is work in progress. But what is important to stress here is that with all those concepts, asset management, resilience, risk management, which are closely linked, the basic thing is that we have to control our processes, our organization. We have to master all elements of our organization to make sure that we are able to cope with future disruptive events. It is not the last one.
Have you used ISO 55000 to help you in this process?
ISO 50000, Hydro-Quebec is not certified, but closely follows the prescriptions and good practices of ISO. It is an activity right now with Hydro-Quebec, which is quite high, with high importance.
And you feel that that's helping the resilience efforts?
Sure, it is no doubt, because with your adequate asset management approach, you master the processes in organization, you master your risks, you must the performance and fitness of service of your assets. You know what critical assets are, what less critical assets are. You are able to allow your resources at the good place at the right time.
Okay. Are Jesse and Brian, are either of you using ISO 55000 as part of resiliency efforts?
Well, lifecycle engineering, we do a lot of, we help organizations build up their asset management programs, and everything we do is based on the ISO 55000 standard. We have a lot of customers that are actually going for certification, and then a lot of customers that might not go for a certification, but we still coach them along the same process of ISO 55000.
We do the same. And then we've got our quality evaluations team that actually does the certifications of those things. We, for ourselves, we're not an asset intensive organization. We're a people intensive organization. We use, however, when we look at as a matter of fact, we just wrapped up our annual risk review of our organization, our company, and we use a very similar process. We use the fundamentals of ISO 55000 as part of that framework when we're going through what are the risks. We just don't apply it. It's not physical assets we're talking about. Usually it's everything else.
Interesting. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So again, if you go through typical things and looking at what gets called out with regards to ISO 55000, for instance, we've got the emergency plans in place that we have to put in. We talk about, it's funny you guys mentioned mutual aid. We talk about similar thing with our parent company, ABS, the American Bureau of Shipping. So what are the ways that we can help each other in the case of certain risk, pandemic risk being a good example? How can we've been locked down, for instance, for several months and not able to travel internationally. How can we share our resources, the people, not necessarily trucks and things like that, but how can we use those people across where they have a presence in a country and we can't? And then what are again, it's exactly what you guys talked about in the paper. What are the accounting principles that we use in order to share those costs? Those are the types of things that we look at in our overall risk management plan. And I hate to call people assets because they're people, but in actuality, we think of them as far as these are the critical assets to our business. And if we have a failure in them, how do we recoup from that?
Yeah, that's a theological and theoretical issue that we struggle with. And basically we talk about the knowledge and experience that the people have are the assets, the resources. Yeah.
Yes.
But we're going into a lot of discussion on that. So now I'm going to pose a question as if you were the king for the day. The Asset Leadership Network has developed a national asset leadership strategy. We are saying that the United States is one organization. It's beyond just the United States government. It includes state and local government, all the citizens and the organizations inside of it. And that if there was a national asset leadership strategy, the conversation could be more pointed and directed and have better outcomes. How can the country itself become more resilient? And Dragan, if you want to share any examples that you might know of what Canada is doing as a nation, that would be fine too. But I suspect you're aware of the US approaches also.
Yeah. In fact, it is an international effort, It is only as a country we could do a lot of things, but it is necessary, but I think it is not sufficient for coping with kind of events like pandemic, COVID, and so on. It is an international effort, you know. The globalization and the open frontiers means that, say, a virus is traveling in 24 hours around the globe, you know, and we have to have this international collaboration for coping with those soft disruptive events.
Excellent point. I thought I was making a big statement and you made it even bigger. So I appreciate that. Jesse, if you were king for a day.
Right. So I think looking at the UK's example through a Center for Digitally Built Britain, Center for CDBB. If you Google CDBB, Center for Digitally Built Britain, you'll see some great examples of how they are looking at public infrastructure at the national level. You know, again, all of these systems work together. You can't have a transit system without the power, without the water, without other transit systems. You need to plan for resilience. You need to plan for asset management together. Of course, if you're running a transit system, you have to have your transit system's asset management program and your resilience program, but you should think about expanding that to other stakeholders. It's also really a good example what they're doing there in Britain to look at the use of digital twins for public infrastructure and see, you know, that way if there's different agencies, different organizations that are crossing over each other's assets, either through process or through construction or something like that, they can understand what they're dealing with without causing disruptions. They can eliminate disruptions right from the beginning, and then they can reduce that response time that Dragan was showing in his graph there. They can reduce that. So I think there's, you know, king for a day, I would continue to push for a standard, continue to push for digital models around public infrastructure that allow people to model not only the assets, but the processes and how people interact with those processes and how these systems interact with each other. I think, you know, we just started on that in North America fairly recently, and it'll continue to mature.
Brian?
Yeah, I actually echo Jesse. The only solution there is go with the digital twin sort of concept. We look at that a lot in the offshore space when you're looking at FPSOs and drill ships and things like that, where big, large, complex systems, and when you're talking about the national, you know, public, you know, everything from trains and airplanes to electricity and everything else, that's even a bigger concept. But when you have something like a digital twin to that, it really, I think, allows you to understand how the change management piece and how adding something into one section, how that impacts the rest of it, and any cascading effects and that you'd have there. There's not, without having some large, very, very large governmental agency to oversee this in some way, which I'm not an advocate of. I think doing something like that would be about your best solution. So if I were king for a day, that's what
Digital twins.
Digital twins.
So
I wasn't trying to steal Jesse's. I just think in terms of our own, he probably has a very similar experience that we have here with regards to I won't say easy solutions, but better solutions for more comprehensive problems like that.
And I'll just add that I would pay ISO whatever it took to make ISO 55000 free to everybody in the world.
There you go.
I think if the United States government did that, gave them $1.5 million, whatever it is they need, that would be one of the best things the US could do to improve its diplomatic status around the world. Any closing comments?
I have to leave for another meeting, but don't forget that the key, that it is the top management that holds the key for resilience and asset management,
Thank you for your real life example, Dragan. That really drove home the importance of resiliency. Appreciate that.
Okay. Hi. Thank you very much.
And Brian, this is your first panel with the ALN. Welcome. So glad you could
Thank you.
join. And look forward to having you on other programs. And Jesse, thank you so much for coming up with the foundation for this paper and for this program. Really appreciate it. Look forward to working with you more in the future.
You. Great.
All right. Bye, everyone. And thank you to all of our attendees. Appreciate your interest in this. And of course, thanks to our patron sponsors and our organizational members, which LCE is, and the ABS group is a patron member. So thank you both.
Mike, thank you too.
All right. Appreciate it. Bye for now.
Bye, guys.